A while back, I made a build video covering the meta healing builds for both Trials and non-Trials content in the Elder Scrolls Online. While I was and still am pretty proud of that video, I think I didn't get to do each individual build the justice that it deserves. So over the next week or so, I'm making a little 3-part mini-series called Healer Build Breakdown, where I'll be doing a deep dive into those meta healer builds. My goal is not just to give you the what, but the why as well. The explanations in this video will assume that you've got little to no healing experience, so if there are any veteran healers watching, this will probably just be a refresher for you guys. My name's Doc, your host for all things healing, and in this video we'll be covering the dungeon build. Let's go ahead and get into this. So when I first published the original build video, I had referred to this as the non-trials build, which I think may have been a tad misleading, and I do apologize for that. One of the recommended sets for this build is still from a trial, though I do have an alternative this time around, but the reason I call it the non-trial build is because the build itself is made for any PvE content that isn't a trial. So think dungeons, arenas, overland, etc. The main goal of this build is to maintain a high major courage uptime, giving your party some extra weapon and spell damage. Then, during boss encounters, you give your party a huge burst of increased damage through Major Slayer and Major Force. Because it is a dungeon build, we won't need quite as much healing, though I wouldn't say that this hybrid build will certainly still be almost pure healer because this build is made with Vet HM dungeons in mind. It's just that we'll contribute a little bit more to team damage and debuffing than on a Trials build. So let's start with the basics. For our race, I pretty much exclusively use Bretons for my healers. Their increased magicka regen, and decreased spell cost can be pretty substantial in boosting our sustain without having to change anything about our actual build. Of course, though, race isn't tremendously important, so if you don't care for Bretons, you're wrong, but other good races include Argonians, High Elves, Dark Elves, and Khajiit. When it comes to class, I'll be demonstrating this on my Templar, and I'll be sharing the details with Templar in mind. However, this build can work on all classes, so if you don't care for Templar or you don't want to make one, then feel free to use whichever class you enjoy the most. The main reason I'll be using my Templar is just that it's my main and it's what I enjoy using the most, so, if you need to swap out some class skills whenever we get to that section, please go right ahead. So for our attributes, you're going to want all 64 into Magicka for the heal/damage scaling and resource management. For our Mundus, you have a few options. I personally use the Atronach for some extra Magicka recovery in dungeons because I find that in a dungeon setting, especially on a Templar, that sustain is a little more difficult to manage, and we really don't need the extra healing. Of course, though, the Ritual Mundus for the extra healing and the Thief Mundus for some extra crit damage and healing are also fantastic options. For our food, I generally prefer foods that affect both our health and our magicka. In an ideal world, you shouldn't need the extra health, but having that extra health gives you a safety net in case things go sideways. To achieve this, we'll want to use the Clockwork Citrus Fillet, found from completing Brengolin's questline in the Clockwork City Outlaws Refuge. It provides us with an increase to our max health and magicka, as well as an increase to our health and magicka recovery. I will say though that even though Clockwork Citrus Fillet is easy to get, it is pretty costly to make, needing a perfect row to make this, which those are not super easy to come by. This is why I generally use the Witch Mother's Potent Brew instead. You can buy it from guild traders, so it's easy to acquire, and the only ingredient that you may need to go out of your way for is some nightshade, which isn't too hard to come by. It gives similar stat bonuses to the Citrus Fillet, even if it isn't quite as strong. For potions, I usually end up using Tristat or just some simple Magicka potions. You could run Heroism potions if you really feel inclined, but I find that dungeon bosses are spaced far enough apart, and fights typically don't last long enough for you to really benefit from Heroism potions. I'd recommend saving your Heroism potions for some trials instead. Up next, we'll talk about champion points. For our blue CP tree, you'll want From the Brink. This will give your allies a huge damage shield if they fall below 25% health while you're healing them. Ideally, you'll have some sort of heal over time constantly ticking away, so they should get the shield pretty much instantly. I've pulled off plenty of clutch saves with this whenever something goes wrong, and I highly recommend it. Next is Swift Renewal. This increases the amount of healing that your heal over time spells do. This is a great perk to have because, like we mentioned previously, you'll want to have a heal over time spell active throughout the fight, meaning this will be one of your main sources of constant passive healing on your teammates. Increasing the amount of healing that these can do can help keep teammates topped off without needing to rely on burst heals. Next is Soothing Tide. This increases the amount of healing your area of effect heals do. You'll want this perk for pretty much the exact same reason as Swift Renewal. AoE heals are constant, passive healing that helps your healing be a bit more proactive than reactive. With both heal over time spells and area of effect spells constantly healing your teammates, you can place your focus on other things like buffs, debuffs, or mechanics. And number 4 is Enlivening Overflow or Hope Infusion. This will sort of just depend on your personal preference because they're both fantastic options. Enlivening Overflow will grant you and or your team a pretty generous amount of recovery to all 3 resources when you're overhealing. And Hope Infusion will grant minor heroism, generating some ultimate for you and or your team whenever you heal someone below 50% health. I personally tend to go for Enlivening Overflow, especially in a dungeon setting, because I find that you're overhealing much more often than you're healing someone below 50%. Though, if you enjoy Hope Infusion, it is absolutely worth running. For our red CP tree, you'll want Boundless Vitality. You can't heal people if you're laying on the ground. This will give you some extra health as a cushion in case things go sideways. It's especially useful if you're a Warden, since they can apply the buff Minor Toughness, which will increase your max health, and that buff is percentage based. Warden healers can have a pretty sizable health pool without losing out on any of the good healing tools. Next is Fortified. Very similar to the last perk, Fortified will increase our survivability by giving us some extra armor. Like I mentioned before, a dead healer isn't healing anyone. So between Boundless Vitality, Fortified, and your healing, you should be pretty hard to put down. Next is Rejuvenation. This will give you some extra magicka, health, and stamina recovery. While stamina and health recovery aren't super important for healers, they're certainly nice to have. The magicka recovery is great for healers though, as this is another example of some small sustain bonus that we can add without losing out on any of our healing tools. And lastly, it's a flex spot. There are several options here that you can use depending on a few things. By default, I usually run Celerity or Spirit Mastery. Celerity will increase our movement speed, making it easier to not stand in things that are bad for our health. Spirit Mastery will increase your revive speed, and while healers are normally not the ones going for reses, sometimes a healer can actually be in a very good spot to go for a res. If you're a Templar, this is even better, since Templars already get a revive speed increase passive skill. Man, that was kind of a mouthful. Revive speed increase passive skill. Oh my gosh. All right. Otherwise, if you're running something that has a lot of crowd control, Slippery or Expert Evasion are also fantastic options. For our green CP tree, it honestly doesn't matter. You can just run whatever you feel like. A lot of these slottables are going to change with update 45, and very few of them actually affect combat anyway. Next, let's talk about skills. Before I actually explain each individual skill, please keep in mind that for this build, I will be using my Templar. So the skills will be reflective of that. Again though, you can absolutely run this build on any class. Like I said before, you'll just need to swap out the class skills with skills from your own class. If you need any recommendations for those, please feel free to leave them down in the comments. Okay, let's talk about skills. In our Restoration Staff front bar, we will start with Purifying Light. This Dawn's Wrath skill is a nice little burst of damage with a decent heal after it ends, though the main reason we'll be using it is to proc our class passive Minor Sorcery, which increases you and your party's spell damage by 10%. Next is Combat Prayer. The healer's bread and butter, found in the Restoration Staff skill line, this will be our main spammable. It grants anyone it hits a burst of healing, Minor Berserk, and Minor Resolve, meaning this skill is a heal, a damage boost, and a defensive buff all in one single skill that can hit multiple people. Next is Healing Springs. Found in the Restoration Staff skill line, this is a solid AoE heal by itself, but for this build specifically, it's actually being used in conjunction with the Master's Restoration Staff to grant some extra resources to teammates. We'll talk more about it in just a minute. I like Springs for the extra recovery, though if you wanted to use the other morph of this skill, that is also totally fine. Either one, it's just up to your preference. Next is Luminous Shards. Typically, this is where we would have Energy Orb from the Undaunted skill line if we were on another class. But for Templars, this is a decent damage Adric Spear skill that provides a solid resource restoration synergy. The reason we don't use both this and Orb is because that synergy shares a cooldown. And since we want to contribute a little more to damage in dungeon settings, this is the perfect skill to replace Energy Orb. Next is Radiating Regeneration, a fantastic heal over time skill from the Restoration Staff skill line that will help keep our teammates topped off and continuously proc Spell Power Cure. Since Spell Power Cure relies on overhealing, you'll refresh the Major Courage buff, which will increase the team's weapon and spell damage with every tick of this skill. And for our front bar ultimate, we have Reviving Barrier. We're not typically going to be casting this Alliance War skill, but it can still be useful in a pinch if the encounter starts going sideways. The main reason we have it is for the Magicka Aid support line passive, which will give us an extra 10% Magicka recovery just for having this ability slotted. On our Destruction Staff back bar, we will have Destructive Reach. This Destruction Staff skill is a spammable, a damage over time, and an elemental debuff all in one. It's not the best at any of those things, but it's a nice way to debuff the boss for your team and do a little extra damage yourself. Next is Elemental Blockade, and the main reason that we're almost always going to have this Destruction Staff skill on our back bar is so that we can proc our back bar enchantments. There's also a chance that it can apply an elemental debuff to an enemy as well. Next is Extended Ritual, a fantastic Restoring Light AoE heal that has a large range for times when your party might be a bit spread out. In a dungeon setting, I don't typically find a lot of use for the Cleanse synergy, but it is still really nice to have nonetheless. Next is Overflowing Altar. This Undaunted skill will apply minor lifesteal to all enemies in its pretty generous range, which will essentially act as another heal over time for your team. Of course, the synergy is also fantastic for tanks, helping them restore 65% of their max health. It also helps that this skill costs health instead of magicka, meaning it's very low cost in the long run. Next is Echoing Vigor, another fantastic heal over time skill that costs stamina instead of magicka. This skill from the Assault Alliance War skill line, like Radiating Regeneration, will help keep our teammates topped off and contribute to Major Courage uptime. And finally, for our back bar ultimate, we have Aggressive Warhorn. Now this is the ult we're going to cast. When you cast this ultimate from the Assault Alliance War skill line, all teammates in a pretty generous range will receive a 10% increase to their max magicka and max stamina for 30 seconds, as well as gaining Major Force, which will increase critical damage by 20% for 10 seconds. And finally, we are going to talk about our sets, traits, and enchantments. First, we'll talk about our front bar set, or in other words, this will be the main set that you wear in your chest, hands, legs, shoes, and belt spots. The goal is to have this set be active at all times, and you'll generally want it to be a set that has a very low cooldown or requires a very high uptime. In these spots, you'll want to have Spell Power Cure. Found in the White Gold Tower dungeon, this set will provide your teammates with Major Courage whenever you overheal them, which gives you and your allies a hefty weapon and spell damage buff. It's arguably one of, if not the best support set in the game, and it's also very easy to farm, as White Gold Tower is honestly pretty easy these days. The weight will be light, because the set is only available in light, but that's okay, because light armor is best for healers anyway. For the enchantments, we'll want all max magicka for the extra sustain and scaling. For the traits, we'll want Divines, which will increase our Mundus Stone's effectiveness, though I will say, if you want to do this, I also enjoy using the Infused trait for big pieces, and when I say big pieces, I mean the pieces that have a higher enchantment scaling. Like for example, you can put the same Max Magicka enchantment on a chest and a belt, but the chest will yield more Magicka. Putting the Infused trait on these pieces will result in making these big pieces give you even more Max Magicka. Next, we'll have our back bar set, or in other words, this will be your backup set that you'll want in your jewelry and secondary weapon slot. This is usually reserved for a set that does have a pretty high cooldown or that you only need to activate once in a while. The reason being is that if you're using a mythic item or an arena weapon, you won't be able to have both 5-piece sets active at all times. So you'll have one set that will only activate when you swap to your back bar, hence the name back bar set. In this spot, you'll want Master Architect. Found in the Halls of Fabrication Trial, this set will provide you and your allies with a pretty long duration of the Major Slayer buff when you cast your ultimate, which will increase damage done to group content monsters by 10%. Pairing it with the Warhorn skill that we previously mentioned will give your allies a serious damage boost. For our jewelry, we'll want the Arcane trait to increase our Max Magicka, and enchantments are usually either recovery or spell damage, or sometimes a combination of the two. You can kind of just feel out what works best for you. As your secondary weapon, you'll of course want a Destruction Staff, which will have the Infused trait with either the Crushing or Berserker enchantment. If you're curious as to which element you should use, it honestly doesn't really matter that much, but I do have a video on my channel going over that if you're interested. Now, I do understand that not everyone can or wants to run trials, so I'd like to offer an alternative here. If you prefer, you can always use Powerful Assault in your back bar spot. Casting a skill from the Assault skill line, so in this case, Echoing Vigor, will give you and your allies a buff to weapon and spell damage that is smaller than Spell Power Cure, but these sets do stack. You can find Powerful Assault by purchasing it with the Telvar currency in the Imperial City, or you can buy it from guild traders. It is a little bit expensive, especially the Ice Staff, but it is worth it in my opinion. You can always get the Lightning Staff instead of the Ice Staff if you want to save a little bit of gold. Traits and enchantments of everything will all stay the same regardless of which of these two sets you choose to use for your back bar. Next, we'll move on to our monster set. A monster set is a 2-piece set that is only available in the head and shoulder spot. You'll find the headpiece from completing the corresponding veteran dungeon, and you can buy the shoulder pieces from the Undaunted Enclave using Undaunted keys. For our monster spots, I like to use Nazare, which is found in the Vet Shipwright's Regret dungeon. This set will increase the duration of debuffs applied to enemies whenever you cast your ultimate. So, as you can tell, there's a little bit of a theme in this. Pairing this set with Master Architect and Warhorn makes an already powerful ultimate combination even stronger. For the weight, I like to go with 1 medium and 1 heavy. The reason is that there is a passive skill in the Undaunted skill line that gives you extra health, magicka, and stamina whenever you have at least one kind of each armor weight. This improves our survivability, gives us better sustain through a higher resource pool, and makes a lot of our spells even better since a lot of them partially scale off maximum resources. Now, there are a lot of people who will swear by 6 light and 1 medium, or just 7 light. I personally still prefer the 5-1-1, but you can make that judgment call yourself. Finally, we have our arena weapon or mythic item, and in this case, it will be a restoration staff that we'll have as our primary weapon. That weapon is going to be the Master's Restoration Staff, sometimes called Grand Rejuvenation. Found in Dragonstar Arena, it gives extra stamina and magicka recovery to anyone who's hit by the initial cast of the Grand Healing skill. Since this will be your front bar weapon, you'll want to have the powered trait, which increases our healing, and you can use whatever enchantment you feel like. I personally tend to go with either absorb magicka or weapon damage, but honestly, it really doesn't matter. Wow, okay, That was longer than I thought it would be. Though, I gotta say, it did really make me realize how much I wasn't explaining in that original video. So I hope this video was helpful for all my aspiring dungeon trifecta healers out there. I'll keep this outro short since this is already a pretty long video. Make sure to tune in this weekend for the next installment where I will be covering the Rojo Warden Trials build. And I think all I've got left to say is that I've been Doc. Take care of yourselves, be good to others, don't forget to pick up your daily pledges, and I will catch y'all in the next one.